Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second EduGrowth Launchpad Essentials Insights seminar. I'm Lynn Hayes. Jeanette said I'm the director of the Leading Learning Institute, and I have done a little bit of work with EduGrowth as the innovation lead at Charles Sturt University for the last few years. I'll moderate today's Insights seminar on behalf of the EduGrowth team. EduGrowth is Australia's education, technology and innovation industry hub, and through connection and collaboration, EduGrowth accelerates Australia's EdTech ecosystem globally. EduGrowth was founded by Charles Sturt University, Deakin University, Griffith University, La Trobe and Monash Universities, and Navitas, as they believe that Australia can be central to the digital transformation of education, both here and around the world. So today, there are hundreds of members joining EduGrowth programs, and you are currently joining this public seminar under the Launchpad program for early stage startups. So welcome to those people who are joining us this afternoon. I know we have audiences joining us from different states across Australia, as well as special guests from India. So before I proceed, I would just like to pause for an acknowledgement of country. For our traditional guests joining us, we formally do this acknowledgement to show awareness of, whilst providing our respects to the traditional custodians. As we gather today physically dispersed and virtually connected, allow me to pause and acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognise their continuous and unbroken connection to the land, waters and culture across the country. Today, I join you from the traditional land of the Yuin people on the beautiful south coast of New South Wales, and I extend our respects to their elders past, present and emerging in all of Australia, including from where you are joining us today. I add specifically my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present with us today. So here we've got our agenda for this afternoon. You will be hearing conversation from Lauren Sayer, the Executive Director of Digital Learning and Research and Innovation at Melbourne Girls Grammar School, and Herk, who's the CEO and founder of Cadmus. And this afternoon, we're exploring the topics of pedagogy and piloting, which I think is a really interesting topic and certainly something that has a great impact on those people who are trying to enter into both the K-12 and higher ed sector as startups. So after the conversation, we'll encourage everyone to join the networking session that's going to be on, and you'll be able to meet with each of the presenters and myself in the breakout rooms after the conversation. Now, before we jump into the conversation, I would also like to give you some background of the Launchpad Essentials Insights seminars. The Insights seminars' purpose is to directly support early stage EdTech companies and those thinking about founding an EdTech business or building up their MVP. The Insights seminars invites industry experts to share their insights with early stage startups over a 1.5 hour session fortnightly across 8 weeks. And participants are also encouraged to work through the Launchpad Essentials online resources and share their insights while they hear from industry experts discussing how they built some of Australia's leading EdTech companies. Besides today's seminar for pedagogy and piloting, there are also 2 more seminars discussing the topics of marketing and sales strategy, and we'll give you some more information about that, those upcoming events after the conversation. Today, we are also welcoming a cohort from Indian EdTech founders who are joining us for this series. So hello to our Indian visitors who are joining us today. They came from the Victoria-India Innovation Exchange Program. They are interested in hearing about the Australian education market from experts, but also from you and their peers. The Victoria-India Innovation Exchange is about building bridges between the Victorian and Indian education innovation sectors, so we gain deep insights from each other's respective ecosystems. You will have time to meet our Indian founders during the breakout sessions at the end of the conversation. So now I'd like to invite you to join Lauren and Herk and myself exploring this topic. Can I say that we are more than welcome to have people putting any questions or comments into the chat. During our conversation, I'll be monitoring that. So if anything is raised that I think is important for either Lauren or Herk to comment on, I'll certainly raise that. So please use the chat for that. So, okay, moving into our formal conversation. So as I mentioned, Lauren Sayer is the leading voice in the Victorian and national education community throughout her 30 years of career. She's now part of the executive of Melbourne Girls Grammar School, where she's developing best practice in learning technology, digital literacy, and building an evidence base for modern digital capability. And also welcome to Herk. Herk Kailis is the CEO and founder of Cadmus, an EdTech company that's improving the quality of education globally through better assessment experience. And Herk leads the executive functions of Cadmus and is responsible for commercial operations, including university partnerships. So just as we're about to start, if I could ask people to just switch off their camera, change your view options to speaker view, which is the best way to enjoy this conversation session, and make sure that you add your comments and chat and questions into the chat. So Lauren and Herk, I'd like to start first, and I think I might start with you first, Lauren, if you don't mind. Given that we're looking at pedagogy and piloting in this conversation, would you like to start with just defining for us what you see as pedagogy?
Yes, thanks, Lynn, and thank you everyone for being here today. I think pedagogy is an overcomplicated term sometimes and is something that, but really if we look at what pedagogy is, it's what a teacher does each day to influence learning. So it's teacher practice at the heart. And so obviously pedagogy sits really strongly in that teaching and learning ecosystem.
Thanks, Lauren. And from your perspective as in an EdTech company, how do you view pedagogy and how does that inform the work that you do?
Thanks, Lynn. So for us, I think pedagogy's always been an important consideration and somewhere where we often look to as a synonym for beginning with the customer. So for us, figuring out what the problem is we're trying to solve, aligning that up with the pedagogy, and then looking for a solution. So I think pedagogy to us means teaching and learning, really, as a sort of fancier word to say that, and moving away from the jargon. So how do we implement the best teaching and learning for the specific customer, I think is how we break down that sentence.
And so then moving on from that, and I think in terms of what you're saying, it's synonymous with starting with the customer's needs. How then, Herk, does pedagogy inform the user experience and user interface for your product?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think with a specific product or a specific need, the pedagogy might be different around what that specifically is. So for assessment, understanding what the relevant pedagogy is always also related to understanding what problem you're trying to solve, and then finding the intersection between the two. So it's sort of different for different things inside universities, and it'll be different for different problems inside schools as well. And I think for us, figuring out what the right pedagogy is for assessment really aligns up to what problems are we trying to solve around assessment, but more broadly, what problems are we trying to solve and address in the institution, whether they're student experience, graduate outcomes, student success and grades, making sure students don't drop out of the institution. How does the function of assessment and the pedagogy around assessment help to improve those benefits and outcomes in a way that satisfies the different user groups in an institution? And it's from those who adopt it, whether they're students or teachers, all the way to those through to who have impact in the solution and what it might be. And there's lots of examples of solutions that might work, but the pedagogy is wrong, and they ultimately don't sort of make the make the muster.
Yeah, thanks for that, Herk. Lauren, would you like to add your perspective on that, particularly from a K-12 perspective?
Yeah, I think the philosophies around teaching and learning in K-12 differ from context to context, and you'll find a school, and it's really important, and I think it goes back to what Herk said of finding out your customers' needs and where it sits before you go in and offer a product. Because if you look at a school that has a strong focus on explicit instruction and being able to teach in that specific way will be a very different product offering than a school that's very interested in a project-based learning or design thinking approach. And those two, and understanding that really means that and I think what Herk said was really interesting. I don't think I've ever had an EdTech company ask the school what the teaching and learning philosophy or the pedagogy of the school is. And I think it's a really key question, because that will allow to match up. And I think we're going to talk a bit later about pitfalls. One of the big pitfalls around that is not understanding the context well. So I know I've worked in contexts where there's been strong philosophical opposition to certain areas, and then a technology company comes in and goes, well, we want to do this. It's never going to get off the ground because that is not that philosophy for that school. And schools tend to have a pretty strong standpoint as to their methods of teaching and learning and what they hold dear to them. And I think the good thing about that is there's lots of schools and lots of different processes. So from a market perspective, if school A doesn't fit your product, don't worry, because there's a lot of schools. But it's really understanding that there's no one fit for all schools, especially in the Australian EdTech environment. Schools are incredibly diverse. So we don't tend to have a homogenous teaching and learning philosophy in our schools across Australia.
Thanks for that, Lauren. And there's a question here just in the chat for you, Lauren, about how much does an individual teacher or principal inform the pedagogical approach or even the philosophy in a school? And so what is that what is your philosophy at Melbourne Girls Grammar, for example, with respect to what we're talking about here today?
I think in terms of, it would depend. I think your principal always has a strong influence on your school, but good principals bring all of their teachers along, and it's part of a global discussion. And it's really interesting, Jeanette, that you've put this in, because it is exactly what we're going through right now at Melbourne Girls Grammar. Is we are sitting down as a learning organisation and we are looking at what we want as far as a learner profile and our ways of working for our girls. But we are also looking at what do we hold dear in terms of our teaching. And I know that doesn't answer your question, Jeanette, but what we strongly follow around is a science of learning and neuroscience perspective at our school, and with a strong hybrid technology backbone. But we do see our teachers and the formation of knowledge in an explicit sense as being very dear to us.
So thanks, Lauren. I think that's really important, because what you've shown then is for any EdTech startups, if they were looking at approaching either a university or a school, they really need to understand where the context of that school or university is coming from in terms of that. Herk, would you like to add anything to that? Because I know that you've worked with some different universities, and I'm sure you would have seen or felt different approaches.
Yeah, I think Lauren's spot on with her comments. It's always different at different institutions, and part of that comes down as a EdTech company segmenting your market correctly and understanding who Melbourne Girls is or who University of Melbourne is relative to other institutions and other schools. And so I think universities, like schools, expect you to be prepared when you come and have those conversations, to have done your research and to have read the strategic plans and to have looked at what the strategy for that institution is and to look at who the key stakeholders are and what they've been saying, and to then come in really well informed around where their pain points and what their issues are specifically. And I'll give you an example, but proctoring's been a big one over the last 12 months globally as a sort of piece for assessment, and how proctoring mirrors the invigilated in-place assessment tasks that go on. But from a pedagogical standpoint, that has an enormous number of drawbacks in terms of what it means and the philosophy and the principles, the types of assessment, the types of outcomes that can be encouraged throughout it. So that if you don't understand that and you go into an institution pitching that thing and you don't know that they don't align up with that very well and their philosophy is to move away from those types of assessments, you can get lost in sort of that piece. So you need to have done your research, you need to understand who you're talking to. And I think more and more, it's harder to get people like Lauren's time and other key stakeholders at institutions. You're expected to be very well prepared when you come in for those conversations, and anything that's publicly available, you should have read and sort of been informed about, and be able to then offer a solution, which is having understood their pain points, then working together to solve something that might actually provide a lot more benefit.
Okay, thanks. I think that was a valuable insight there too, in really doing your research there, Herk, given that there's a breadth and a lot of diversity within the K-12 and higher ed sectors. Really try to target some individuals probably at an institution to really get a sense of what's happening behind the scenes, because often the public facing information on a website may not give you the answers to the questions that you might have. Lauren, did you want to add anything to that? I saw you took your mute off for a minute and I thought you had something to add. No? Okay, thank you. So, okay, well then let's move forward then to in terms of trying to uncover, and this is building on what you were just talking about there, Herk. So how can you uncover students and teachers' needs within a school? And what are some of those pain points as well? So Lauren, would you like to provide some advice for some of our audience on that, please?
In terms of professional networks that are around, it's really important for EdTech businesses to know that schools are not necessarily the brave innovators everybody thinks they are, and we like to jump onto things together sometimes, and looking at professional learning networks. So in Victoria, we have Vine, which is the Victorian IT network that's there. There's Mighty, which is an Australian IT managers network as well, but then there's professional learning associations. I also think events like this, where there are educators that are here, but really being able to offer opportunities for listening. I came into this role at the start of this year and I moved from one EdTech product to another, and I was absolutely blown away that one of the EdTechs invited me into their offices for the day and listened. Now, we're an existing customer of how that worked, but I'm one of their biggest advocates of how they work, because they sat down and they said, so tell us what's happening with you at the moment and how that's going. And it wasn't about a product pipeline. It was really about getting to know. And that person is in, I won't do a shout out right now. He might put a shout out in the chat. He just did. It's James Leckie who's in here. But I think it's incredibly important that not to make sure, one of the things that I would be aware of in finding user stories is speak to more than one person, because personnel change in schools and they go from school to school. So the schooling ecosystems are very small environment, and we go and we all talk to each other, and it's incredibly important that just because your product isn't in one context right now doesn't mean that teacher or leader won't move to that next context the next day. And I think that that's very important, but actually just spending the time to listen and not necessarily offer answers. And one of the things James did was just sit and take notes and ask questions, and didn't prescribe to say, well, I think this is the way you should do things. And I think that really strong development of, well, what is the user story and context for you as a school is a great way. But how to do that for an EdTech is to make sure that you're involved in the community and you're part of those discussions. So if you can get into small networked discussions, that's where, as Herk said earlier, getting time, one-on-one's an absolute privilege and very hard to get because our diaries are incredibly full. But going to networking events where you can sit and have a discussion is incredibly important. And I think it's worth being aware that it's these sort of small networking events that as a decision maker, I'm moving towards, and I steer away from large conferences in terms of, 1,000 EdTechs in a trade hall or how that works. I'll be honest, as a decision maker, I could think of nothing worse than attending that for 2 days. And then all of a sudden I get 35 follow-up phone calls that I have to then deal with meetings. That's not how I want to work as a decision maker. So a bit of a pro tip in that regard is those small discussions. I think there's more benefit in showing up to the discussions and sitting next to a decision maker than there is standing in a trade show in the hope that a decision maker will walk up to you.
Yeah, very interesting advice, Lauren. Thank you. Herk, would you like to provide us with a little bit of insight about how you have worked at trying to uncover the sorts of needs of students and teachers within the higher ed context?
Yeah, I'll mirror Lauren's comment there on going to trade halls with 1,000 EdTechs in there. We haven't done that yet, Lauren. I don't think we're going to do that even after your comment. So yeah, it's good to know we don't need to do that. But I think for universities, they're so big, there's so many people in there, they often do publish an inordinate amount of information online. And so you can do a lot of research on who you're going and talking to and understanding what they're doing well at and what they're not doing well at. And they publish that as well everywhere. So those numbers are all public information as to what their student experience are, what their retention, what their student success rates are, and how they get funded and where their shortfalls are. So there's a lot of information you can unpack and understand. And often in institutions, especially in times like this, they're either looking for ways to save money or make money. So it's really that justification they need to make around a product in some respects. There is the pedagogy around it. There is the fit for the institution. And that is on the other side of that piece, a critical component. But in times where you're struggling to get budget and you're fighting for budget, you need to make an alignment around those pain points for an institution on how they make decisions and what the funding impacts of those decisions are, especially with the Australian context, international students impacting the bottom line of Australian institutions, redundancies happening. So the funding situation is really important, understanding what that is, and that's freely available information to go and get. The pedagogical side of things and what fits in for the institution can also be worked out in many respects from segmenting the market and then reading what their strategies are and then finding out about the key people that are involved. And I can't mirror Lauren's points enough here that the higher education sector is the same as the K-12. People move around. It's very, very much an ecosystem of 43 big universities who all talk to each other and who all change positions pretty regularly in one way or another. So you really need to make sure whoever you get in with to start with, you do a wonderful job with because of the referenceability of the market. And burning customers early is a really dangerous approach to take. And even more so, trying to learn on the customer is a very dangerous thing to do. So if you're trying to pull apart pain points and trying to launch fast and implement your product in a higher education setting, it can backfire if not done correctly, because you can get really bad press. You can have shocking results. They'll tell everyone in the same sort of groups that they sort of frequent, and then that can keep you out for a couple of years. So how you do that pain point discovery and how you actually build your product and your understanding of the pedagogy and the pain points and those different bits and pieces, it needs to be quite strategic. Because it's not a consumer market where you can just launch, make mistakes, iterate necessarily with big universities who have sort of long memories of things that don't work well, especially with EdTechs and technologies that promise a lot and sometimes don't deliver what they've promised. So it needs to be done quite strategically. One way to do it, and this is the way we did it, is to partner with an institution or a number of institutions and ask them to put up with you for a few years as you bring this product to market. And so we took a very long time to get our product to market because we wanted to make sure the student and the teacher experience were exceptional before opening the doors to other institutions. So there's a theory in EdTechs and just in tech companies in general, which is build a product your users love and then scale it. Don't do the two things simultaneously because you won't build user love and you'll churn out of everywhere. So I don't think that's any more true than in this market here, where if you build something no one loves, you sort of struggle along for a while until you die.
Yeah, and I think Herk too, you're really seeking out, like in terms of your success in universities, it's really seeking out a champion or a couple of champions really who see the need, and they're going to be able to push it through the different levels of decision making that are happening in a large organization like a university. And it's because they want to be actually seeing it implemented with their academics. So it's not really coming just from, you know, speaking to the IT department about it, is it? It's about partnering with those who are looking at implementing this and integrating it into the curriculum.
Yeah, it's a great point. Great point, Lynn. And I think sometimes people get confused about who they need to go talk to in an institution, and it's almost always not IT. It's who's got the most to gain out of this solution, who can look like a champion if they implement it, who wants to get a lead in a particular area. And so often it's for us in teaching and learning, we look, and it might be a deputy vice chancellor who can see themselves with the product or with a company to be able to get a large advantage in an area. And if they're the first mover, they'll put up with some pain to be able to deal with that. So identifying who those people are is often the first challenge, and you can kind of knock on all the doors and find out who responds to the emails. That's one way of doing it, because whoever responds and whoever's willing to put up with some pain is usually someone that's looking for an edge or an advantage. So there are a number of those universities in Australia, but they're in every market, and there are a number of those schools as well, but they will help co-create your product. They'll help put up with the pain of the product not being fantastic because they're in it for a journey in which they expect to see some really big improvement that your product can actually achieve. And they share the vision with you, not necessarily the product of today. And so if you don't quite get those customers right, you'll lose the ones that don't want to put up with the pain today, and you'll sort of not quite get that to click as nicely. But that would be the gold standard, which is finding a reference group of customers prepared to put up with pain, prepared to help give product and pain feedback to you so that you can develop a product that they can get a lot of benefit out of, and they can get an advantage by being first with.
Yeah, so like in a higher ed setting, you might have like a sub-dean of learning and teaching, or you might have a sub-dean of learning technology, innovation. They're people that are bringing the technology and the pedagogy together. They're using technology to solve pedagogical problems. And so often they're the kinds of people that would have, you know, a very pragmatic approach, and they'd be definitely looking for those solutions.
I'd also add to that, Lynn, that it's almost people higher up the chain you'd want to get involved as well. I think deputy vice chancellors,
DVCAs,
the DVC academic, and even the PVC academics are the people you want to get involved. They have more sway in terms of navigating an institution and in terms of pushing initiatives through, and they have a budget that they can rely on, and they have strategic project buckets as well that they can use to sort of generate funding. And without that help in navigating an institution, EdTechs can get lost in universities. There are too many groups, too many stakeholders, and too many dead-end conversations that you need to make sure you get alignment with someone who can cut through the noise early on to save you the time of figuring out that piece and can help you do the important stuff of getting your product to market. Oh,
you're on mute, Lynn.
Sorry, Lauren. Lauren, there was a question in the chat that I thought would be useful for you to maybe answer, if possible. It's, with each EdTech company having a different specialised product and schools having a fixed curriculum / objective to follow, where do you see the bridging happening?
Yeah, I think this is a timely thing of, I can tell, I counted up because I thought, ready for this. Last week, I had 17 people offer me business propositions on LinkedIn to come into my school to fix a problem that I didn't have. I've given up responding to them. I've given up. If the first thing you're going to do is approach me with a pitch, I don't have time for that. Teaching and learning is the bridging needs to be listening to the schools and the networks. And James Leckie put in the chat before, the Twitter, or how it is, where people are talking and then they'll say, we're social beings. Teachers don't get into this because they don't love to talk. We stand in front of classrooms and work with kids. We love to talk and we love to broadcast. So one of the things is, we will tell you via multiple networks what the problems are. That's when you provide a solution, not providing me a solution to a problem I don't have. And if I get another LinkedIn, it's almost to the point that I'll totally remove the connection altogether because they haven't listened. But if I ask a question on Twitter, and I'll put my Twitter in the chat during how that works, of, has anyone solved this? And someone sends me a message and goes, well, I'm working on this and I'm solving that. I'll have a chat because you've listened to my need, and then there's a match. And it's not just Twitter, it's LinkedIn conversations or things like that. I think we'll ask for problems, we'll ask for those solutions of how that works. But I'm not sitting there looking for solutions to problems I don't have. In that space. So I think it's, again, having those conversations at a really ground level. And then there's different areas that this is emerging. So one of the ones in a K-12 space is every Sunday night on Twitter, there's an Aussie Ed chat via Twitter. And each week there's a theme. The new one where lots of people are, and I see a real merge in teachers and EdTechs, is via audio chat and Clubhouse. So I'm seeing more and more Clubhouse discussions of EdTechs and teachers talking together in that really low threat discussion forum. So I would say, as a new place to go and talk to teachers, get involved in Clubhouse, because lots of teachers are on there and lots of EdTech, and they're going in there to have conversations together. So it's incredibly purposeful. And so it's really these purposeful conversations of small groups that are incredibly important, but don't try and solve a problem that we don't have.
Yep. Lots of great advice there, Lauren. Thank you. I think I'm aware of the time, so I'd like us just to move on, just to explore what some of the quantitative and qualitative metrics that your organisation uses to measure their success and effectiveness of EdTech. Now, I'm wondering if I could hand that over to you, Lauren, first. Is that okay?
I think in this, our metrics are not, I'll start with what our metrics are not, and then I'll move to what our metrics are. Our metrics are not viewership or enrollments of how that works. And I think Herk might talk more on that. We had a conversation the other day around this of, I've seen so many, oh, well, you're using this, you've got this many hits. I don't care how many hits there are. I want to know, is it improving the life for our students is number one. If it improves their life and ease of use for our teachers, number two. And I think it's a bonus if it saves money. It's an essential if it saves or streamlines time in that space of that. But we're a learning organisation. So number one, in an EdTech specifically around that, is it going to improve learning productivity and teaching productivity of how that works? So whether that be time, results, of how that works, being able to do that. And then the other one is ease of use for teachers, because I know that there's always, I've worked in EdTech integration for a really long time. Everybody always expects there to be a bit of a hump. I don't think someone might be able to tell me a product that has, but I don't think technology originally, when you first go, has made any teacher's life ever easier straight off the bat. There's always this frustration gap. And I think one of the metrics in that space is that ease of use and knowledge of other systems. So if it works like another system a teacher already uses, that's a key metric as well. But really what we're looking for is it improving learning productivity or is it improving teaching productivity? And those two key areas is success here for us.
Great, thanks, Lauren. Herk, can I hand over to you now to respond to that question about metrics?
Yeah, I think Lauren's spot on. It's I think the thing to add to that is that there are a lot of things you can get trumped out of the university for or the school for, and there's a base level of stuff you need to have, which if you don't have, you're a red flag right away. So if you don't have, and I know Lauren knows this, single sign-on, if you don't have privacy policies, if you don't have compliance, if you can't do technical due diligence, sometimes it's if you don't have SLAs, if you don't integrate into all the tools they use, it's just too hard. And so when you're getting evaluated at a pilot stage or a trial stage, often it's a very small group and they're extrapolating out what the results are. So even if you only have 10 flags that come through as support requests or problems with the tool, and they're going to extrapolate that out 100 times or whatever the scale of the pilot will be. So there are a number of things you need to sort of get right just to come to the party. And often that makes it a very high barrier to entry, especially in universities where you need to be, depending on where your tool fits into the ecosystem and the stack of tools, you need to make sure you talk to all the other tools. So if it's assessment, you integrate into the LMS. There are 4 LMSs, you need to make sure you integrate into all of them. Everyone uses Turnitin, you need to integrate into Turnitin. Is the experience of integrating and working in Turnitin and the LMS through your tool harder or easier? And that talks to Lauren's point that if it's harder, then they're not going to use it because it's more work for everyone and it's going to be too difficult. So you actually have to be able to fit into all the things that they already use and need, and actually be able to, on top of that, improve the experience and actually decrease the cost. Because if it's more cost to do it, then the benefit has to be much, much larger than it already is. And to get large scale numbers of people to change, it needs to be really easy. So think the terms and conditions on Apple. It's got to be that easy to agree and that easy to shift to. Otherwise, people are gonna struggle to take up your product. And even if the benefits are there, people are going to go, yeah, but it's too hard to log in. Or, hey, but I have to send the grades through an export function. Or, hey, I need 3 people to help me run it in my tool. So I think there are a number of trunks in there that you need to overcome to sort of get to the party. And then I think it really goes down to what they're measuring on is how does it impact the users that are actually implementing it, and does it solve their problems? And often it's just a conversation with the students or the teachers to say, hey, we implemented this because you identified these pain points. Did this solve it for you qualitatively? And if everyone's coming back going, hey, this was a huge success, I'd love to use it again. I don't have the numbers, but I felt like this really worked well. And everyone says the same thing. Then more often than not, they're going to take those opinions over even what the data says. Maybe there's a lag, maybe there's other factors at play, but they seem to trust people in the organization to give them the right information. So that's less of a consideration early on. It's more the quantitative piece is a consideration later on when there's greater justifications of rollouts and sort of price as well.
Okay, that's great, Herk, and you've sort of covered a number of red flags and no's when it comes to evaluating a product. Lauren, do you have any more to add to that list?
Yeah, I think the knowing, understanding the technology and the human ecosystem within the school of how that is, if you're not integrating with it, I'm not interested. No school in K-12 is interested in another standalone product that doesn't sit within the ecosystem. Data housed offshore is a no-go in schools. So it's now one of the key questions I ask of where is your data? And I'm at the point with a couple of projects that are in flight at the moment where I've stopped them because the data's not in Australia and they will not restart until our data is in Australia. Lack of privacy. I think one of the interesting ones is data portability and of, well, what happens if I no longer want your product, and or how do I get my data in and out, and how does that work? And I look at in EdTech, this is going to become more and more important. If I go back 6 years ago, which isn't that long ago, really, 6 years ago, making the decision to move from LMS1 to LMS2 was not really an issue. There was nothing worth keeping in it. People weren't using it because paper was more efficient. Where now I look at previous schools and how it works and going, oh, wow, that product. But all of a sudden, it's that hard to get out of those things that you can't move to the next great product. And I think it's data portability both ways. I think as an EdTech, if you've got a really great product, having that integration that you can get data from, you can move from one to your product is really important. And then I think to keep people like me that like to feel safe in that space, being able to get out of that later is incredibly important. And I think also in terms of the product, understanding that this sort of product in an EdTech is sometimes a software and sometimes a service, and both of these stay true no matter what that is. So not all EdTechs are trying to sell me a piece of software. Some are trying to work with us as a service, and actually really looking at those same things. What are the privacy policies? Where is our data and our conversations kept? And how do you sit within our ecosystem of how that works and sit with the philosophy? But really, I think those red flags of integration, data and privacy, and single sign-on, you're not even getting from that landing spot these days.
Yeah, Lauren, I think you're right. I think they're the ones that you have to get through the door. The other ones that are coming about are important, but they're not going to stop you necessarily from getting in at least to higher education. Data portability, everyone wants to know about it, but if you don't have the other things, they just won't even look at you, or you won't even get a conversation through the data in Australia one. You can't work with an Australian university if you don't have that.
I think more and more schools are also looking, it's not just schools looking to data portability. They're not just looking for it in terms of being able to move to another product. A lot of our year 11s and 12s, and we're moving from reports where you used to get your PDF and you'd have it and then you'd email it, to having micro credentials and some sort of portfolio. And our students want to take their data with them. And I think one of the interesting things is this new concept of Generation Alpha, where they don't like all of their data. They're incredibly data aware, our students. And I think people would be surprised at how many 15, 16, 17-year-olds I know in my school of girls that are actively not on any social media, will not let their parents upload their videos, will ask me questions in my role of where is the learning management system data going and how is it stored. I am not just getting those questions from governance and risk anymore. I'm now getting those questions from students. And that is really important. I think the next generation of students coming through are incredibly data aware, and they do not want their data being everywhere. And I think that's important.
And it's what's happening also globally. I think on that point, Lauren, GDPR compliance is, once you get out of Australia, you have to sort of tick off on those things anyway. So it's not just in this context, it's actually a global context, and that's the way everything's going. So if you can't give people their data and delete the data and do those things, it becomes harder and harder to sort of win new customers and also satisfy your existing.
Thanks, Herk. Okay, so now let's just move on to if someone was, you know, fortunate enough to be in a situation where they were having conversations with a school or a university, and they're at the point that they were like on the cusp of actually managing to lock in some kind of pilot program, I'm just wondering if we could get a sense from both of you, from both of your contexts and perspectives, what are the key things that you would need to be agreeing on before you started a pilot program? So Herk, would you like to start based on your experience with higher ed and doing what you've been doing?
Sure. I think there's a lot of different, it depends what sort of a pilot you implement and how you set up that relationship. One of the things to align up is expectations. So depending on where your product is up to and what outcomes you can achieve at that point in time, getting some alignment with key stakeholders. If your product is early stage, you don't want them thinking they're testing a final product. You'd rather them align up, we're testing your product for these capabilities. And if it achieves those, you're going to reach the next compliance point and the next compliance point. So that alignment piece early on is really important. And then also figuring out what success looks like up front. So they're doing this because they think this can be a success. If it is successful, how does this impact or change what they do as an institution going forward, so that you can effectively plan as an organization what might happen if this works well. If it works badly, then you drop out anyway. So there's sort of no value in planning for if it goes badly. The results are always going to be you fall out of there. But if it goes well, what does success then look like? And how can you actually have an approach where you start aligning up some of those next steps concurrently, because institutions, universities can be slow moving places. So if you don't pick up momentum and engage with the right stakeholders and validate with the right committees and the right groups, you might stall. And the stall at a university is usually a full semester, which is 3-4 months. So you're actually not going to get the uptake. And then you may miss out on budget and it might be a yearly cycle, or you may not get any more of the same budget that you got. So I think the two things that are probably important are to understand the person you're talking to, what they actually hope for to see as success. And then if it is successful, what will your next steps look like, so that you agree on those up front, as opposed to having to come back and try and have those conversations on the back end.
Thanks, Herk. Lauren, can I hand over to you and get you to just provide a perspective from the school context, and what would a pilot look like in your school context?
I think what Herk said around setting the expectations and sitting around the table and looking at what success will look like is incredibly important. On that, I think understanding the K-12 environment. So lots of people will offer a pilot project in a term. Understanding that a term goes incredibly fast in a school. So if I look at, this week, we've got school athletics and we've got another 4 events. So basically, and it's a 9-week term. So to get a pilot off the ground in a term, or to offer a school a free term and then ask them to evaluate and buy a product, is not a great value proposition in the K-12 market. Of if we're looking to pilot, we plan things out year on year, and being able to work on that long-term pilot where we can have the time, because a term is far too fast for schools. Even an 11 or a 12-week term, by the time you put all the events in, teaching time is incredibly limited. And I don't think unless you're in a school, you really can appreciate how many events sit in schools by the time you've got your guest speakers, your school sports, house, and then you have competitive weekend sport and all these different things that sit in school, and events and Mother's Day and how this works. Being able to then have it is important. So time, expectations, I would have to, what are the costs going to be when I'm expected to pay? So it's great to have it, but there needs to be an indication of what the costs are, and are they staggered costs? Because if I'm doing it free for the first year of this, and then you're going to be developing your product with us, I'm going to ask for a discount, because we will be troubleshooting, beta testing, how that works. So what is that agreement and how does it look? Because that's incredibly important of how that works, and how can it be unwound if the pilot's unsuccessful? And back to that red flag I had, or what happens to our data after that year? So if I'm putting, I've got 1,100 students across Melbourne Girls Grammar. If I'm putting all their learning data into something for a year, I'm going to want to know, if it doesn't work, how I get it back out, and what you do with it, and whether you're using that to develop your product, and how this works. So back to those red flags. Examples of really good pilot experiences, and I can give you an example of a really bad one if you'd like, Lynn.
Yes, please. That's what I'd like to move on to now. Yeah. So give us, a really good example of a pilot and how that worked. And then if you'd like to give us the flip side of that, that'd be really valuable as well.
Yeah, I think a really good example is, and I'm not going to name companies in this because they'll end up hating me forever, and I don't want to name and shame, but a really good one is a curriculum content company who sat with me in a previous role and said, we've heard that you're looking for a specific type of curriculum content, and we'd like to work and build that with you. And so we met with that department, and the teachers all said, well, we would like to be able to do that. There were partnerships with other organisations, so they were partnering with other governmental organisations, and how that worked. And we said, this is something we want to get into. And there was a clear agreement of what our contribution was to the product, and therefore what we were getting out of it, and what the company were getting out of it. And then over a period of a year, we co-collaborated, presented together at conferences as a partnership, and we went on to purchase that product at a discounted rate in year 2 and year 3, but we continued to be advocates for that. I think one of the important things of when a pilot goes really well and you become a customer, it is really wonderful to keep loving that customer and how that works. And so even as this morning, I was invited to a business breakfast, which I couldn't make, but I appreciated the invite, and it was for all foundation customers that had signed up and been part of that process, and year in, year out. So this is a company, we've been foundation customers for a long time. We've had a long-term relationship with them, but they don't forget about us. And I think that's incredibly important. And on the flip side, where it doesn't work is where you agree to things and there's no exit strategy, and you've got a discount, but by the time you're looking to go in, and it's probably sitting on my end, it's the fault is sitting with people sitting in my role, not necessarily the company. But if you look at, you've put all your data in, and we've put a big startup of getting everyone to make their content and put it into product X, and product X has never promised to deliver, and it hasn't delivered at all. I'm now in too deep in that scenario to be able to get out easily. But what you then have is a disgruntled person, and I don't think you want disgruntled customers out in the marketplace in that space. You don't want that when a school goes, how is product X? You don't want them to be going, oh, we're in it, but we can't get out, and I'm not happy, and I'm not going to use it no matter what. And again, back to that small ecosystem, we all talk, and just because we're using a product doesn't mean we love a product, and we all ask each other. And I think in pilots, if a pilot doesn't go well, making sure that there's a win-win of getting out is incredibly important, because you don't want a disgruntled customer out in that marketplace.
Thanks, Lauren. That was an education in itself on pilot programs and partnering with people. There was some really gold little gems there for people to really understand how difficult that can be from the user's perspective. Herk, would you like to provide some examples of pilot experiences that you've had and any insights that will be useful to our audience?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a few points just to add to that. We found that working with people early on, and this is at all levels of an institution, who are prepared to put up with some pain or prepared to find a way that the solution can work, even if there are issues with it. It's always easy to pull something apart or to find a hole or to find a gap and to then make the whole story about that. But it's a harder thing to have someone who's capable of seeing the bigger picture and seeing how this could work and then being able to implement it and achieve the success. So identifying who those people are early on can make or break your pilot. If you pick the wrong people to pilot your product in an institution and you don't have the right alignment between the academics or the teaching team, and they're not prepared to actually do what it takes to move things forward as a team, then you're going to get bad results. And in some instances, you need to learn what that looks like and who those people are and what those experiences are to not have to go make those mistakes again. But it's often the people who are not really interested in piloting something. They're more interested in, will this be perfect? And if it's not perfect, then I'm not going to ever use it again and not going to say good things about it. So I think finding who that group is, whether it's at a customer level, whether it's segmenting the market, whether it's the key stakeholders in the institution, whether it's the teachers that you go and find, make an enormous difference. We had an early client, a foundation client, who the Deputy Vice Chancellor showed them the product to a group of people in the institution. And we just had like a blue screen of death situation where it just kept loading and nothing happened. And she sort of smiled and laughed to the group of people she was presenting it to. And she said, geez, I love this company. Aren't they great? And like, it's a disaster. Everything was code red. You know, there's alarms and fire bells going off at our place. But they're the sort of people you need to be able to find early on to put up with some of those sort of issues there and overcome them. And obviously you don't want to have that situation happen. That's everything's fallen apart and gone wrong. But you do need to find people who are not going to then go, well, the login button didn't work this one time and I clicked it the second time and it did, and then it worked, but I'm not going to use it again because it's buggy. So I think finding who those people are is really, really important. And the other part of it is just making sure you also, with your pilot customers, get that alignment piece right around what it is you're delivering. And so we had a situation early on where we pitched our product and we thought, you know, it's this thing and it's definitely going to do solve this problem around academic integrity. And then it did that, but that's not what anyone wanted. And so we sort of found out that, hey, we've built this product that's solving this issue for this customer, but no one at a user level actually wants to use the product because firstly, the pedagogy is wrong, but then a whole lot of other issues associated with it. So with those pilot customers, it's trying to build a relationship and that you can actually set the expectations correctly, you can get the feedback, and then you can go and iterate things. And so when we iterated our product very early on, we didn't lose those early customers. We lost some who weren't right, but we were better off losing them anyway because we were spending so much time trying to satisfy them. The other ones were just like, okay, we'll just live through this pain. You guys are working on this thing. You figured out this first thing wasn't right. Great. We didn't really love that anyway. But if you build this other thing, which is going to be better, then we're invested in that. So it's trying to get that alignment in really good pilot experiences. And you always learn the most off your best customers and your best users. And you learn very little, if a negative effect, from your very bad customers and your bad users. The good customers teach you what to do, and the bad customers don't teach you what not to do. They just teach you all this other stuff you shouldn't be doing anyway, and you end up firefighting and you wonder what the hell you're doing. So find the good customers, listen to them, figure out your processes, fill in the gaps. It might be, hey, we need data portability. Hey, we need a privacy policy. Hey, we need single sign-on. Hey, we need all this. And they'll teach you what to do and they'll put up with it. And then the bad ones just won't tell you anything. They'll just say, hey, it didn't work, and hey, it's a disaster, and answer this support request. And you just won't even figure out to build the documentation, to build the integration. you kind of go around in circles. So find the good ones, work with them, and try and not work with the ones that are more difficult until you're more established. And Crossing the Chasm is a really good book for that. It kind of highlights how to segment that market out and which customers to look for early on and what traits they have, and then how to actually work with those ones and why they'll actually work with you in the first place, as opposed to picking up the ones that you might want, but they don't want you, and figuring that relationship out.
Great, thanks, Herk. Herk, would you mind just typing that title in the chat, just in case anyone wants to follow up on that? Now, there's just one question that was in the chat, which I'd like us just to address, and then we will move on to our networking session. The question here of, in the context of pedagogy, I'm wondering if the panel can comment on the attractiveness or otherwise to teachers/schools of courseware/curriculum inclusions. That is to help teachers integrate a service into their teaching. Lauren, is that something that you could provide a response to?
I'm not too sure about what the question's exactly asking, Lynn, of the attractiveness. It would depend on the school and the context, what the curriculum focus is for that school at the moment, and is there a need or a gap in what they're doing. So in terms of curriculum content or courseware, I would be hesitant to say, well, all schools are looking for STEM or all schools are looking for computer science, of how that works, because it's very nuanced and it depends on the school strategic plan and their focus. It's about really doing the homework and understanding what it is. But I'd be very wary of making whole generalizations on what schools or teachers need, because it is such a nuanced profession, and schools are very diverse in what they're doing in a content space. So in a content and curriculum space, that's very personalised. I think if you look at broader EdTechs around learning analytics or provision of wider management systems, of school management systems, of how that is, in terms of content, that's very narrow, and it would have to, and I can see there's a follow-on of that, of just delivering. So is there an appetite on that? If it matched the teaching and learning philosophy of the school and a need, then yes. But is there a whole school appetite for pre-prepped content? I'm not currently looking for that, but I'm looking for tools that make curriculum content creation easier for my teachers.
Yeah, good response, Lauren. And Simon, if you decided that you wanted to follow up a little further, once we go into breakout groups for some networking, you might want to just follow up with Lauren as well. Well, look, I'd like to thank Herk and Lauren. I feel that you've really we've delved deeply into this this topic of pedagogy and piloting, and there's been fabulous advice across both K-12 and the higher ed sector. There were a lot of similarities in many ways in the advice that you were providing, but then there were obviously these nuanced differences as well. I do hope that the audience has found this conversation valuable, and you now will have an opportunity, if you like, to actually explore this further in a networking session. So thank you, Herk and Lauren. It's been lovely working with you this afternoon.